Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Today I just want to continue a dialogue between all of us about the future of our state. Throughout the series of speeches I plan to deliver along the campaign, I want to do a deep dive into certain issues, a range of topics, and cover them with all of you. It's my hope that as a result of this and the feedback that I receive, that we can together develop plans and policies that will guide our state forward. Over the coming months, we'll be laying out details of each of these plans because never again should we allow ourselves to elect a governor who runs on a series of platitudes and will not tell us what he is going to do prior to becoming our governor. This speech is going to be about violence. There are plenty of people in this room who know more about the subject than I do. There are lots of people in our city and our state who are even greater experts on the subject. But I think the role of government is to support community-based solutions and not to impose them. Having said that, the government should provide a framework for how it intends to approach every issue so that we can align all of our resources as best we can. Bringing clarity to purpose is the burden of leadership, and so today I hope to outline what my approach would be. As we think about the broad problem of violence in our community, I divide it into certain subsections and problem areas. I'd probably look at least initially 8 different areas. First, I think we need to look into basic economic development issues like education and jobs and opportunity as the core drivers of violence or as its cure. Second, we need to look at reducing the flow of handguns from unlicensed dealers and other illegal channels. Third, we need to deal with a way to divert our at-risk youth and others away from a life of violence. And fourth, we need to recognize that once violence starts, there are techniques of stopping it and spreading it, and we should embrace those techniques everywhere and every time we can. Fifth, we also need to recognize that violence is going to continue to occur, and we need to treat the victims. We need to treat the victims, and not just physically. We need to do more than simply to bind their wounds. We must heal their spirits as well. 6, we need to expand the notion of the victim, expand it from the singular notion that the victim is just the individual who was wounded, and instead recognize that an entire family can be traumatized, and an entire community can be a victim as well, and everyone is deserving of care. 7, we need to police officers that better reflect the communities that they are here to protect. They deserve better training and a return to a full force. And we cannot ask police officers to do more and to work for less. 8, we need a criminal justice reform because how we treat the perpetrator today will have a great impact on what happens to the perpetrator and, frankly, to the rest of us tomorrow. Those are the 8 areas or so that I would hope to begin to tackle in the discussion today. But before we look at solutions, we need to recognize the scale of the problem. I moved to Chicago in the 1980s. The city was incredible then, with great optimism and the feeling that we were leading the world. Harold Washington was the mayor. We were on our way to becoming the first great majority-minority city. We had learned how to govern in a multicultural democracy. We had proudly showed the world that we could enjoy each other's company, learn from each other's stories, dance to each other's music, watch each other's theater, embrace our differences, embrace those differences as our strengths. But then the crack epidemic hit in the 1990s, and the government at all levels was slow to respond, and violence spiked. What occurred in Chicago then was occurring all around the United States. Different cities reacted in different ways. With support from the federal government, places like New York and Chicago pioneered the notion of community policing. Community police officers turned neighbors into friends and enemies into allies as they brought peace to our communities. Crime declined and gun violence declined. Unfortunately, budget pressures at the city level and an unwillingness to raise taxes led to massive disinvestment in public education, a significant reduction in the size of the police force, and the elimination of lots of the training. Threats to officers' benefits greatly impacted morale, and a reduction in support for diversion programs occurred as well. Then the Republican Party, the state of Illinois, was hijacked by a libertarian madman who believes that there is no role for government in people's lives, nor the economy, nor in state support for any form of anti-violence program. And as a result, the funding for those programs was virtually eliminated. And as a result of that, the positive trend in lower gun violence turned against us in 2015. Violence increased so much last year that we hit a record-breaking year. And this year, with almost 400 homicides already, we are on pace to match the terrible record that we hit last year. Just as the murder rate doesn't capture the full story of those who have been wounded, nor does the epidemic of gun violence capture the broader range of violence that is occurring in our communities. It is, however, like a barometer, maybe a despair index of the magnitude of the problem that we face. We have to realize, though, that on a per capita basis, Chicago's not the most challenged community in our state. There are other communities that have more gun violence per person than we do in Chicago. From East St. Louis all the way to Maywood, from Centralia to Harvey, gun violence is a scourge everywhere. We need to address the violence. We need to address it, therefore, as a state issue. We need to help everyone no matter where they live. We need to see ourselves as part of a family, a big American family. Martin Luther King said that no one is free unless everyone is free. I am proof of that because I know that no one is free from violence until everyone is free from violence. Violence which can touch our society anywhere will eventually touch our society everywhere. Just as it did to my family, just as it has done to too many of the people in this room, just as it has done to too many families across the state of Illinois. Opportunity is the enemy of violence. Opportunity is the enemy of violence, but economic oppression is its partner in crime. So I think we need to address these issues as we work to contain the resulting violence itself. As we address the future of our communities and the issues of violence, let's first start with community-wide issues, like our education, our economy, and our opportunities, or the lack of them. As some of you know, I've had the honor of being the chairman of the board of the University of Illinois. There is on the campus there in Champaign-Urbana an area of land called the study plots. They have been in continuous use almost since the time that Abraham Lincoln created the land-grant university system in this country. Those plots, they're incredibly important, not just to the university, but to the Illinois and to the entire world. You see, it was on those plots that scientists and research first figured out that the quality of the soil matters to the production of the crops. If the quality of the soil is not supportive, the crops aren't going to survive. More importantly, though, we realized that we could add helpful nutrients to the once barren soil, and as a result, we could grow powerful crops and feed the entire world. The most important lesson was that when the soil wasn't perfect, we could always still improve it. We could add nutrients, and if we did so, the crops would not only survive, they would thrive. Just as it's obvious now to all of us that soil matters to crops, so too should it be obvious that the quality of our communities determines the opportunities available for the young people. Yes. If the community does not nurture our young people, then the young people will never thrive. We need to nurture our communities. We need great preschools and great elementary and high schools that are fully funded and allow our kids to be part of the 21st century American economy. Thing is, we know that in Chicago today, there are over 50 high schools where the average ACT score is a 14 or a 15. There are over 50 high schools where the average ACT score is a 14 or a 15. 13% of all the kids who graduate any public high school in the city of Chicago graduate college ready to enter the workplace. They're not ready to go to college. They're not ready to work in the modern office. We're not preparing these kids to do great things with their lives. They'll never be part of this economy. We're so undereducating our kids that they cannot get jobs in the office towers in the downtown core. They cannot be police officers. They cannot be firemen. They'll never be teachers. We're dooming them to a life of economic servitude. Our disinvestment in our schools is creating an educational underclass, and then we're allowing economic oppression to force these young people into a life of crime or force them out of our city. The last measurable year, this city got smaller, and it got whiter. The state of Illinois got smaller, and it got wealthier. It got wealthier not because everybody made more money. It got wealthier because we pushed the poor out of our state. We are using strategic gentrification as a weapon against the poor and people of color. We are underfunding the schools because we pay for them with property taxes. Everyone in the state knows we should move to a system of paying for our schools at the state level with a basket of taxes, including a progressive graduated income tax. Everybody knows that that's what we should do. We don't abandon the property tax system because a handful of elected officials make their money on the side as outside jobs as property tax appeals lawyers. If the property tax system wasn't as important, their income wouldn't be as great. We're destroying the lives of 75% of the kids in the state of Illinois so that a handful of people can get rich. This is the root of fundamental unfairness, not just in Chicago, but across the entire state as well. Not only does it cause our kids to be undereducated, it contributes clearly to the violence in our communities. People are dying, they're being killed because we are not providing them alternative economic opportunities simply because they are undereducated. We're not going to stem the violence unless we transform neighborhoods from places where people are just trying to survive one more day. We can't allow that. We need to transform them into places where people can succeed for generations. We need to make sure that when we talk about investing in communities, that we're not just talking about entry-level jobs. We need to invest bottom to top and top to bottom. We need to look at opportunities, everything from summer jobs to things like pinstripe patronage, and make them available for everyone in our communities. Everything from jobs at Streets and Sand to bond counsel for the city of Chicago, from lifeguards on our beaches and pools to the people who invest the state's money. We need to commit to making the supply chain for the state of Illinois look like the people in the state of Illinois. Yes. The second major front is to reduce the number of handguns. We need to address the issue of how they get onto our streets and how we can contain them. The issues of violence that plague our community, it seems to make it worse than any other community in the nation, has been studied for years. It's clear what makes us different than any other city is the access to handguns, and that our unusually easy access to handguns is, on a purely statistical basis, explains why we have greater violence in Chicago than every other major city. We need to reduce the number of those handguns. First, we need to create a state gun tracing program so we can trace the ownership of all guns that were ever used in a crime. The federal government, that's their job. They've been sidelined from this super productive effort of tracing those guns because the gun lobby has bought off Congress, which passed a law specifically preventing the Center for Disease Control's from collecting that data that every police department wants. We're going to cooperate with other states that are creating tracing programs so that our data collection and reporting will be compatible with theirs. In this way, we can end up with a national database in the absence of any help or leadership from the federal government. We're going to license gun dealers in the state of Illinois. You need a license to sell a service that cuts hair. and you don't need a license to sell a gun that cuts down a human life. That must be changed. If you need a license to be a barber, you ought to have to get a license to sell a gun. We're going to close the gun show loophole where people can buy guns at traveling trade shows without having to go through any kind of background check. Gun dealers in this state are required to do that, and yet we let these trade shows in to scoot around it. It's an attack not only on our safety, but on the economy of our state. It puts our own retailers at a disadvantage. We should not give that advantage to the vendors at trade shows who don't employ people here, who don't have stores here, who don't occupy space, they don't pay rent, and they don't pay taxes. Why would we ever give them an advantage? We're going to pass an Order of Protection Act, as other states have done, to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill and those involved in domestic disputes. We're going to ban anyone on the terrorist watch list from receiving a FOID card in Illinois, and we're going to call on President Trump. President Trump, share that list. Share that list with the state police. Tell us who's on it in our community so we can stop them from getting a gun. If you're not going to do that, tell us why you're not doing it, unless you're distracted with your children. And then we're going to confront the gun train issue. We're going to confront the gun train issue. We're going to put the railroads on notice. We're going to say that if their rail lines and their rail yards are used again in a manner that threatens the public safety of the people of our state, where low levels of security are provided to trains loaded with guns, we will seize their rail lines to protect the people of our state. That's what we're going to do. We need to target crime even before it begins. We need to identify at-risk youth and divert them from a life of crime. We need to help them before they are swept up into the vortex of violence that's sweeping across our communities. We know how that diversion works. We've done it in Illinois before, and we've seen it done so successfully in other states. In Illinois, there are great examples of effective programs like Becoming a Man or Redeploy Illinois. Both demonstrate great track records and redirect youth to really productive lives. We'll create a dedicated grant program to support violence prevention service and that are indigenous to communities where support is needed the most. We need to stop the violence after the violence begins. The ceasefire program, which began in Chicago, has had a great impact in lots of other cities. And while it started here, it was improved in other places and over time, and we now have a great model for what works. We can take the best of those elements from around the country and expand what we're doing in our city and make our programs better, more effective, and larger. Stopping the spread of violence once it starts is a proven technique. There are heroes in our communities, heroes who are ex-offenders, who are working to improve the lives of young people. Many of them are proof that the greatest attribute of American society is our ability to give people a second chance, to prove that we are, in America, not only the land of the free, but land of redemption as well. We need to immediately restore the funding to Illinois programs with a great track record of reducing that violence. No longer should the political calculus of a cold-hearted governor stand in the way of protecting our kids. Just as we try to prevent violence, so too must we acknowledge that it will continue to occur. We need to be prepared to support victims, not just in hospitals with sutures. Just as we will need to provide physical therapy for the wounded for months or years to come, so must we also provide mental health support as well. The challenge of trauma is never just physical. Just as we think it's important to have health care clinics accessible to all of our communities, so too must we have parity for mental health issues as well. A broken arm is no more a legitimate form of injury than is a wounded spirit. They both need our help. We must treat the trauma within our broader communities. We need to provide treatment necessary to support children and families and entire communities who have been the victims of post-traumatic stress disorder. We cannot continue to fail to take care of the wounded even when we fail to stop the wounding. For communities disproportionately affected by violence, that means committing to counseling, to social and emotional and mental health access for children attending schools and communities afflicted by violence. We need to make the work of CASEL, the great collaborative for academic, social, emotional learning, which is headquartered at the University of Illinois at Chicago. We need to make that work, their teachings, available in every school, in every classroom in our state. We need to make sure that there's resources for social, emotional learning everywhere. Our property tax burden keeps our school system from putting in place that very staff and programming for the kind of social, emotional learning proven to reach children who are growing up in communities surrounded by daily violence. Children whose minds are occupied by threats or the violence that they've seen that keep them from focusing on learning math and English and silence. This is not the way it needs to be. We have witnessed incredible acts of community healing and great outcomes around the world, even in our lifetime. All we have to do is look for the years in South Africa after Nelson Mandela became its president. We can look to Rwanda and see a thriving economy where there was once constant bloodshed. We can see forgiveness where there was once hate. We can see victory where there was once violence. Illinois should be the place that people look to, a place where they come to look to how we healed our own communities. We should support people in the communities where they are already doing that healing and try to build out their good work. Some say it will never change, but I see it differently. I see an Illinois that goes from being the poster child of gun violence to a model of the modern state. Illinois, where researchers and community leaders come from around the world to ask the question, how did they do it? How did they do it so well? And how did they do it so quickly? In better times, when our violent crime rate was going down instead of up, we were investing heavily in community policing. We were all in it together. It was as if integrating police officers into communities made them seem less like a hostile force and more as a force for good. Now we have a huge challenge. We cannot pay for the police force that we want, or at least we refuse to. Our schools are so undereducating the kids that we can't recruit police officers from the very communities where we need that community policing the most. When budgets got tight, we cut back on the number of police officers, and now we don't have a full strength force like we did years ago. Estimates vary, but it appears as though we have 1,000 or 2,000 fewer officers in Chicago than we did 10 years ago. Our officers complain that the training that allowed them to better integrate into new and different communities than the ones that they grew up in have been cut or eliminated. That training is no longer available, so we breed alienation between the police and community. We try to cut back on community policing because of these financial pressures, and the result has been a disaster. And all of this is caused because of that reliance on property taxes. We threaten to reduce the total compensation package for all the cops in Chicago. And as a result, morale plummeted and pride evaporated. And now we have a department that's as wounded as the city it was meant to serve. And then the governor's action in Springfield to threaten everybody's pensions made all the senior police officers want to retire, robbing us of the examples of their lives of service and role models for younger officers trying to relate to the community, and now they have no one to learn from. The U.S. Department of Justice report on CBD is a disturbing read for anyone, but it's clear that we need to implement the recommendations and the reforms from the Police Accountability Task Force. But most of all, we need to recruit officers that look like the communities that they are meant to serve and protect. If we want real community policing, we need real community police officers. We need to understand that the criminal justice system that we have built is a contributor to the violence in our state. If you're poor in this state, you show up at a bond hearing, the judge who sets your bail will essentially set your sentence. We've lost sight of our purpose. We've lost sight of what our communal point of view is. We need to ask and answer basic questions. Do we think people are inherently good? Or do we think they're inherently bad? Do we want to punish them? Or do we want to rehabilitate them? I believe, even after all that I've gone through, that people are inherently good. Just as I believe in punishing, so too do I believe in the merits of rehabilitation. I think it makes no sense to release someone from prison, someone whose life we have controlled 24/7, 7 days a week for years, and not give them the tools they need, the skills they need to succeed in our communities. If we're going to release people, we should do so in a way that they become great contributors to our society. They should have a driver's license. They should have a state ID. They should have the ability to read. They should be able to participate in the 21st century American economy. Our prisons should not simply be about punishment. They should be about redemption and restorative justice as well. Yes. Now, it's great to live in a state where there are so many not-for-profits and charitable organizations willing to help in the efforts around reentry. We need to recognize, though, that their funding is never going to be enough. Preventing and correcting violent behavior, that's the role of government. We should see the Department of Corrections not so much as correcting bad behavior, but as correcting our broken social safety net by providing people the education they never received, the employable skills they never had, and the social skills they were never taught. In our Department of Corrections, we will appoint a dedicated advisor to coordinate our philanthropic and not-for-profit public services into a comprehensive rehabilitation program for our entire prison population. Let's not fall victim to the fatal attraction of sound bites where we tell the world, oh, we're tough on crime, instead of telling the world that we're smart about it. Let's be a model for revitalization and not the poster child for continued violence. Darwin never said that it was the tough or the strong that survive. Darwin said it was the adaptable. We need to adapt our criminal justice system from one that isn't working to one that allows our entire society to thrive. There is, of course, an economic argument. It's incredibly expensive to have someone in jail. It costs more than $100 a day to keep somebody at Cook County Jail. If all we're doing is releasing them only to have them simply return days or weeks or months later, then we've failed morally and we've failed economically. We should update our thinking from whatever it was in the last century. Just as Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to build strong children than to repair a broken man. So too must we believe that it is better to send forth from our prisons well-trained and highly prepared ex-offenders rather than to simply release a future repeat offender back onto the streets. It's better to give a nonviolent offender a path for the future than to keep him as a career criminal of his past. I hope you get out from all of this, not simply a laundry list of specific programs or the notion that somehow I think I have all the answers. What I had hoped to do today, is more than anything else, was to convey a spirit of solidarity, to reaffirm our commitment as a society that no matter whether you're wealthy or if you're poor, if you live in our community, you should always have an option. Most importantly, I want you to understand how I think, how I feel, and who it is that I care about. I want you to know the nature of my strong commitment to the belief that government can play a great and positive role in improving people's lives, and that is rooted in my own experience. Violence has many roots. It is a weed, and it must be cut down from many different angles. just like the invasive species it is. I've laid out a sort of high-level plans and talked about society in general. I'd like to share with you a story on the effect of gun violence on just one boy's life. Just after the boy was born, a family member was killed, and the shooting was caught on tape. He said he remembered that when his family was relaxing and watching TV at home at night, sometimes they would flip through the channels, and how jarring it would be for them to see that unwanted footage again and again. A few years later, when he was still very young, his own father was killed. And there were photographs of that moment, which also appeared regularly on the news and in the community papers. He lived in a community which had great access to handguns and weapons. His family were activists, and eventually they needed the protection of police presence, and a police cruiser had to be parked in front of their house because of constant threats. He also lived in a community where there was easy access to drugs. He lost an older brother to a drug overdose. Other brothers and cousins were arrested for the possession of pot. Things got worse as drugs became more prevalent and access became easier, and eventually several members became addicted to heroin. Court cases became a regular part of his life. They liked the government, the family did in many ways, but 5 separate times members of his family were caught up in prosecutions which would end up without conviction, or in cases in which, if a conviction did occur, it was overturned. Strangely, the timing of these events in his life seemed to correlate with the end of semesters, time during which exams in schools were always scheduled to occur. His grades suffered. He repeated an entire grade school academic year, and later in junior high, he failed basic courses in math. The teachers were non-union at his school. They had none of the required training or advanced degrees of professionals, and no commitment to continuing education. With no union, there was no oversight of the school leadership either. The principal of the school was eventually convicted and sentenced to 70 years in prison for molesting the other kids in the school. The teachers, they had no understanding of the impossibility of getting a young mind to remain focused on conjugating verbs or solving equations when that mind is still trying to process murder and loss and a fatherless youth and an unresponsive school. The teachers did not seem to understand that he couldn't concentrate on his schoolwork when he was still trying to wrestle with all of the complexities of life in his own community. It was probably unclear to his teachers at that time whether he was bright enough to be in school or motivated enough to do the work. As he progressed through school, he realized that the other kids were being assigned to higher level classes, tracked to go on to college, and he was being put in lower level classes with kids of an uncertain future. This did not do much for his own self-confidence, and by the middle of high school, he was convinced he would never go to college. Eventually, his school recommended that he be sent to an eye doctor who diagnosed poor eyesight. The doctor had a uniquely and truly bizarre theory that bad eyesight could be cured with exercise. He was too young to realize that the doctor was a quack, and a single mother raising a bunch of kids by herself couldn't be the advocate that he needed at that time. Years of a productive life were lost for want of a simple pair of prescription eyeglasses. Eventually, though, people entered his life, people like many of the people in this room who are active in their communities and schools. They accompanied him to meetings with principals and argued against the administration that wanted to throw him out of high school. They arranged extra help for him and eventually made it possible for him to transition from adolescence to adulthood. They talked him into applying to a single college, and when he did, and when he went there, he seemed to thrive. His self-confidence developed, and after graduating college, he eventually took the GMAT. He scored higher than more than 90% of the people who took the test in the United States, and he was accepted to what was ranked as the best business school in the country at the time. Because of the help he had received from people in his community, he became a productive member of society. He overcame his math challenges and eventually handled accounting and finance with the blink of an eye. As a result of these interventions, he grew up and eventually controlled billions of dollars in assets and led organizations with thousands of employees and billions of dollars in annual expenses. He was embraced by his community and ended up playing a leadership role in a lot of the organizations there. Eventually, he became head of a major college. The school had a pioneering program called CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. It became the country's most important think tank for challenges, and he became a great proponent of it, its greatest champion. He never forgot about the people who had helped him out, so he spent as much of his time as he could volunteering on the side. He will tell you that that entire transformation was made possible because kind souls stepped in and filled a void that was in his life and helped him through a time of need. He never misses a chance to thank the people who help others in their time of need as well. Turns out, of course, he's here today. It's me. It's the Kennedy family that I've described. It was the deaths of my uncle, President John F. Kennedy, and my own father, Robert Kennedy, that I've referenced. I understand how difficult it is to go to class, to go to school, to recover from that, to try to excel. Notion that 45 years ago when I was going through kindergarten, first grade, the notions around social learning, the impact of trauma were so primitive at that time. We really haven't made great strides. But what we need to understand is that when 700 or 800 are killed in Chicago, 3,000 or 4,000 people are shot, when that is occurring, that the ripple effect in the community is devastating. There'll be thousands of children who fail to thrive in those early years. The cost of providing the help to help them is far, far higher than the cost of creating a safe city where those things don't happen in the first place. This is why we must act. Tomorrow we will be judged by the next generation on what we did today. Did we lean in? Did we lean in or did we turn away because it was simply too painful, too hard, too much of someone else's burden, some other neighborhood's scourge? Did we retreat behind high fences and gates and rationalization in our own minds? Did we choose to remember the names, to bear witness to the loss? Or did we simply forget the lives that were tragically taken? Did we spend the bounty of our community in every neighborhood, or did we hoard it in just a few? Did we use our own lives to prevent those deaths? Did we sit back in the comfort of our own homes or stand in the streets and demand more from government and from ourselves? No one action will prevent the next deadly night. No law or reform by itself will end the pain of the families who have been lost. But together, slowly, and against all odds, we can end this insanity. We can, we must, we will. There will be no choice, only a charge for all of us as one to rise up together and stop the slaughter. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Bobby.